Hey guys, I really wanted to do a video just explaining some of the things that God has been doing in my life. Recently I went through what I call a desert period where for 2 to 3 months I just didn't feel God's presence. I felt really distant from Him. He wasn't in the places where I can normally find Him. You know, one of the things for me that I can always feel God's presence is in worship, and I wasn't even feeling Him in worship anymore, and so I just felt so distant. And if you've ever gone through this period, you know what I mean when I say that it feels like you have lost someone really close to you, a relative, or gone through a divorce or something like that. You just feel so broken, like you lost something. And I was so confused because I was doing everything I've always done, you know, going to church, reading my Bible, praying, and I didn't understand why I didn't feel God. I was trying to figure out what was wrong with me. But since then, He has brought me out of the desert, and He has taught me so much, and I just wanted to pass on some of that with you in case you are going through a similar phase. The first thing I did was I started to read Exodus, and some of you probably think of Exodus and start yawning. It's a little dry, but for some reason when I was in that time, it started to really speak to me about the importance of waiting. I was reading about the Israelites coming out of Egypt, obviously, because that's what Exodus is, and God made a promise. He promised the promised land, and then He brought up Moses, and he delivered them to the promised land. And that's kind of how we typically view the story. But something I've learned more as I've read more and looked more into the story is that God made a promise, and then He led them into the promised land, and, led them out of Egypt. And that time period was 430 years. It's not like, 20 years or 2 years or anything like that. 430 years. And then, once they were out of Egypt, once Moses had led them out, the Exodus had happened, they waited another 40 years before they ever even saw the Promised Land. So we're talking about a span of almost 500 years between the time that God made a promise and the time that God delivered. Now, some of you may think that's discouraging. You're like, I can't wait 430 years. I'm not going to live that long. But it really spoke to me about the importance of waiting. So often we skim through the scriptures and think, oh yeah, 430 years, or, we totally skim over that and don't even process it. But imagine the desert that the Israelites must have felt like they were in when they were in a 430-year period of not seeing God work. And so it really just showed me the importance of waiting, and that long periods of waiting are all throughout Scripture. We just tend to skim over them. Another scripture that really brought me comfort, or I guess it didn't really bring me comfort, but it's something I really resonate with now, is Matthew 4. This is the time when Jesus was baptized, and then He was driven out into the desert by the Spirit, and He fasted for 40 days, and then He was tempted by the devil. The scripture says that he fasted and then He was hungry. And I don't know if you guys have ever gone for 40 days without eating, but I think He was hungry is probably the biggest understatement in the entire Bible. He was hungry. He didn't eat for 40 days, and then He was being tempted on top of that. And so He was in the state of complete brokenness, physically, emotionally, spiritually, just being broken. And Satan was tempting Him. He was literally being broken down. And then the next verse, in verse 12, it talks about Jesus starting His ministry. So the angels come and help pull Him out of the desert, and then the next verse, He begins His ministry. And that resonates with me because sometimes we go through these times, and I know this happened to me, where we don't feel God's presence, and then all of a sudden, it's like God is saying, okay, now go. and we have such a fire for him, and we're just so hungry all over again, and he's really just relit that passion that we once had, and I all of a sudden felt myself wanting to go on outreaches and bring people to church and be vocal about my faith. And so God really just relit a fire within me. So that was really encouraging to me as well. And the last thing that God taught me, and this is probably the most, this is the most important thing, but it's also the hardest for us to understand, is that it's not about us. It's not about whether we feel God or not. We're still supposed to love God, and we're still supposed to live our lives to bring him glory. And the reality is that we are this much of the grand scheme of things. You know, we're staring at this beautiful 50 foot by 50 foot mural, and we're looking this close at it. We can only see this much of it. Just this small picture of time, of what's happening. But God can see the entire mural. He has a plan for the grand scheme of things, the big picture, the big plan, and we can't see that. So it's quite frankly selfish to be upset that we can't feel God. Because he is working, he is moving, and he is still good, and he is still loving, and he is still an amazing God. But we just are too close to see it. So I hope that this was encouraging, and I hope that if you're in that desert, that you would just be open about it and pour in your community. Another thing that happened to me, that I forgot to mention already, was I was in a place of brokenness, and I broke down in front of my entire community. There was like 30 of us crammed in a hotel room on a missions trip in Las Vegas, and I just broke down weeping. And all 30 people just came around me and laid hands over me and prayed over me. And it was the most amazing thing, because even though I still didn't feel God's love vertically, I could feel it horizontally. I could feel it in those around me. He was using the people around me to pour his love into my life in a completely different way. And so really dive into scripture, keep praying, pray incessantly, now more than ever, and rely on your community. Allow them to intercede on your behalf. And just be comforted by the fact that God is a loving God, whether or not we feel that love, and he is good, whether or not we can see that. Hope you guys have a great day. God bless.